There's a celebration of releasing records. There's also the pace of sort of modern life, and a lot of live music fits into taking a break from that. You know, you're coming to an environment where you're physically in a space listening to music that's not dissimilar to the way you listen to records, or you're reading books, or, you know, going to cinema to watch films, or coming to an exhibition to experience something.
Hello and welcome to the Culture and Technology podcast, brought to you by the Vienna Business Agency. My name is Severin and today's guest is Sean Bidder. Sean is a curator at 180 Studios in London, creative director at the Vinyl Factory, and editor and creative director at Fact magazine. The most recent exhibition he put together is called Reverb, which magically brings all those vocations together. Sean and I met at London's 180 Studios to talk about the process of curating Reverb, the unique history of the Vinyl Factory, why listening to a record still matters, and his recipe for successfully supporting and collaborating with some of today's most iconic artists.
We're in 180 Studios, 180 The Strand, central London. We're deep underground in a very large 20 by 25 metre basement that we utilise to put on large-scale audiovisual exhibitions. But at the moment, it's completely empty.
You just walked us through the latest exhibition called Reverb, which is a celebration of the Vinyl Factory. And I know that you've been involved in both of these projects in a very deep way, both at 180 in Reverb as an exhibition concept and in the Vinyl Factory. So I'm not sure where to start. Maybe we start at the Vinyl Factory and you tell us a little bit about the Vinyl Factory and your involvement there, when it started, how it went, all these amazing collaborations you've done.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I mean, the Vinyl Factory, the epicenter, the kind of starting point, the nexus for the Vinyl Factory is the pressing plant. So the pressing plant, it was the EMI factory, their main manufacturing pressing plant for EMI, which has existed for over 100 years, is the oldest pressing plant in the world. It's pressed many famous records, from the Beatles to the Sex Pistols to Pink Floyd, etc., that are the hallmark of, I guess, the British music industry. The Vinyl Factory as an entity began around 20 years ago, around 2000, when the plant was acquired and renamed. A lot of the fantastic machinery that EMI developed, especially in the 1960s, 1970s, the incredible machines, the engineering, a lot of the presses, the metalwork, etc., that was all kept on. As you can imagine, the machinery was quite old, and there were no textbooks as to how to operate it. So a lot of the amazing craftsmen and engineers that had worked for EMI passed on that knowledge and information. And the Vinyl Factory reimagined vinyl. I mean, at the time, EMI had been bought by an investment company and they didn't see a future in vinyl. So that's why they sold off the pressing plant. We really built a business from vinyl which reimagined that in a modern sense. So the pressing plant was this incredible craft-led factory that enabled you to make these wonderful records. And then the internet, something called the internet had come along, which allowed you to be able to let people know about those records, to market those records, to provide information, communications about those records and releases, and also sell directly to people all over the world. So suddenly there was a new model, a new opportunity to align that kind of incredible machinery and know-how with artists and artistry. Mm-hmm. And that was how the Vinyl Factory began.
I love the story, and it reminds me of many similar stories that happened in and around the early 2000s. There's this project you're probably familiar with that actually originated in Vienna called the Impossible Project, which has a very similar story with Polaroid. They bought up the factory in the Netherlands because they wanted Polaroid to continue and to exist. But the investor, the new owner of Polaroid, didn't believe in it anymore, and they had similar problems with getting the know-how of how to work with these machines and the chemicals, because there was so much knowledge and expertise in it that got lost with the old staff and engineers leaving. So I feel like there are some similarities, and there's probably more stories in this fundamental shift from analog to digital media that happened at the time. Zooming out now from the particular story of the Vinyl Factory, which is obviously very successful, how would you interpret this shift now 20 years later you were able to make it happen, but many other companies weren't able to survive this shift from analog to digital, but you kept analog media alive somehow. So what's your take on that?
Well, from our perspective, I think that we didn't see that there was an intrinsic divide between the two. I think a lot of people felt like you had to be either analog and physical or digital and new media, but I think the two can coexist, and actually one can benefit the other, and it certainly did in our case. As I mentioned, the actual processes involved with making a vinyl record are very physical and very analog, but the way in which the records can be marketed, distributed, sold, communicated, the communications around that is all digital. And even more so, and I think as digital has grown from the sort of the early 2000s version of the World Wide Web until through social media, that communications, that level of self-publishing, etc., has only helped broaden the interest and appeal in things that are or were once much more analog focused. Maybe some of the things that were lost were some of those companies didn't perhaps realize the advantages that digital would bring to their businesses. Now, within this Vinyl Factory exhibition, we have a listening room, a place that people come and listen to records, which is quintessentially analog. It's just a vinyl sound system, people playing records. But the way in which that is kind of shared and communicated is all digital, virtually, apart from the people that are in the room. At any one time, there are only 30 people in the room. But the posts that are created and the interest that's generated reaches hundreds of thousands. So I think the two can be mutually beneficial.
So back in the days when you started the Vinyl Factory, I guess it was you together with a team.
I wasn't responsible for starting the Vinyl
so
Factory.
You joined
there was a visionary and entrepreneur called Mark Wadwell who bought the pressing plant, and he started the Vinyl Factory. In my role, I came from a publishing background. I was a writer and editor when I was working in different cultural magazines, and I met Mark, and he had a vision for vinyl and Vinyl Factory, which was something akin to the one I've explained, but he wanted to be able to communicate that vision because it wasn't a vision shared by anyone else at the time. And the mainstream music industry thought vinyl was dead. A lot of people were interested in niches within vinyl, re-releasing old records or a particular niche in music. But we wanted to make the whole process feel exciting and vibrant again. And it just went back to the beginning of what made it like that. It's a physical product. It's about the artwork as much as the music. It's the tangible experience of playing records. You're sharing music with your friends, etc. It's not about a particular type of music. And so we created a magazine which tried to showcase that kind of connection between the art and the music. And that magazine was called Fact.
And that came out of the Vinyl Factory.
Yeah, it was a reference to the Vinyl Factory. Within Vinyl Factory, there's Fact, but also to the factory itself, a factory, a process of making things, and also to a record label, to a Factory Records, which was an iconic British record label, which I suppose more than any other potentially blended this fusion of art and sound in a non-pretentious way. So we began that, and we distributed that initially in a very analog way through record shops. We physically distributed 25,000 copies of this throughout the UK through record shops, etc., and it was free. And then as we evolved, we became digital, and we communicated to many more people around the world in that way. But the ethos of what we were doing didn't really fundamentally shift. It was always about new ideas, new music, this kind of fusion of art and sound.
So did Fact magazine work as an addendum to the collaborations and the music that was pressed on vinyl by the Vinyl Factory, almost as a larger story and the context to the releases that you've created?
It did that, but also it was more broadly initially about vinyl culture, an idea of what vinyl culture could be and was, that wasn't fixated with particular genres or more commonly accepted ideas around vinyl, like the collectability of it and the kind of the technical detail. It was more about what's exciting about it, what's interesting about it, how culturally can it be extended into different areas. So that was how it started. And then the label itself, the Vinyl Factory record label, emerged shortly after that. And in a way, that was more like a physical representation of all these ideas. So it was working with musicians and artists to release records, to create vinyl editions that sort of push the boundaries of creativity, both sonically and artistically, within a familiar framework. I mean, it's a record. We weren't breaking the mold in that regard. We were just doing things slightly differently. Those collaborations involved some really well-known people of the time, like Massive Attack and Pet Shop Boys, and then some more experimental, emerging kind of artists. And that was always our ethos. We weren't fixated around popular music as such. It was more about interesting ideas. And those could be produced by popular musicians as much as sort of experimental musicians.
Were these releases based on limited editions from the get-go?
Yes, they were limited, but they were limited in different ways. So I think for us, we were always interested in fundamentally the excitement around what you're producing, but in the belief that you could create something that's limited and exciting that's 100 copies, or something that's limited and exciting that's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 copies. So there was always a model in that, and for the artist as much as the sort of the fan. But the pressing plant at one point in its kind of EMI heyday, the pressing plant made 20 million records a year. And it had its own train station. Is that big? Hayes, where the pressing plant's located, was known for being the home of the British music industry. And by the time we were making records, we were more focused around making 1 million or 2 million records a year to a really high standard. And it become a different entity. To some extent, some of those limited editions were limited because the demand wasn't the same as it subsequently became. There was a vinyl resurgence sort of 10, 15 years later, where there were new audiences coming to buy vinyl records that didn't exist at that time.
And when you say high standard, high quality, is this the entire production way, from choosing the artist, choosing the music, to recording studios, to... Is there a difference in quality in how you can make a vinyl? Is there like lower quality pressings?
Yeah, there definitely is. I think fundamentally it was more a case of trying to make the thing as good as it possibly can be on different levels. So yeah, you can definitely make a better or a worse record. It's just like anything. There's two fundamental things. There's the ingredients, like food, for example. I mean, with vinyl, the fundamental ingredients, what are you using to make the records from? Some people were using recycled records. It's not going to be as good quality if you're using a record that you're recycling. So that's the first thing. And then before that, even the processes of mastering the record, because there's just skilled technicians involved in different aspects of it. And then when you press the record, what the machinery you're using to actually manufacture the record, is it consistent? Does it sound good? Are people checking it along the way to make sure it sounds really good? And then what are you going to do with the artwork? It's a bit like book publishing. You know, you're going to just stick it in a sort of soft paper back, sort of make it as cheap as you can and produce as many as you can, or you're going to spend a bit more on it and the hope that someone who likes books or likes records is going to be able to spot that and be happy to pay more for it because they feel like they're getting more as a result. So it wasn't too far from that in a sense. And we always wanted to make things affordable for people in different ways. So for us, you know, you could be a collector at 16 or you could be a collector at 86, but you might have more disposable income at 86 than you do at 16. So for us, it was really important that we'd be able to make some records or a lot of records readily available. So even though they were limited, they weren't that expensive. And then some things that we did were more expensive because just the production of the actual release was a lot more. So I think that was important because we also wanted to grow the audience. And it's not dissimilar to the things that we do now in terms of the big exhibitions we do at 180 Studios. We have a very young audience, and a lot of the audience coming here is like 18 to 35. We're mindful of that, but we're not producing shows for that audience. We're just producing things that hopefully are exciting. They're certainly exciting to us. So hopefully that there's that sense of excitement that's passed on.
So especially with younger audiences, now we can make the transition to Reverb, the exhibition we just saw. Do you notice a difference in how young audiences perceive vinyl or the record as a thing itself, especially in the last few years where I feel like short form content and media consumption has increased so much, but also the demand for vinyl and records has increased as a sort of refuge to a sense of authenticity and scarcity? How do you notice that in the reactions?
That's a valid point. There are people that are coming to the exhibition that clearly collect vinyl or are interested in vinyl, and there are people coming to the exhibition that are just interested in the exhibition or interested in what 180 are doing or interested in some of the artists that are participating in the show or have just been recommended it by someone. So we're always excited about that diverse audience. I think with vinyl itself, you can see that more generally there's a resurgence of certain kinds of music, jazz particularly, especially in the UK. And with those kind of music, vinyl is very much kind of the format of choice. Yes, no artist in the current climate is ever not going to release anything digitally, and they'd be foolish not to, for obvious reasons. But I think there's a certain history to releasing records within certain musical formats. There's a celebration of releasing records. There's also the pace of sort of modern life, and a lot of live music fits into taking a break from that. You're coming to an environment where you're physically in a space listening to music that's not dissimilar to the way you listen to records, or you're reading books, or going to cinema to watch films, or coming to an exhibition to experience something. But as I said before, none of that precludes doing anything digitally or with any other media. I just think all these things coexist. And if there's anything that's common about our practice, or just the habits of younger and older people today, I would say, it's very diverse, and it's very it functions on many different levels, and the choice of media doesn't preclude one from the other. So I think you can be into records and into digital art, and there's no problem with any of that. And I think for us, we were never, even when we were on the record label, we were always interested in blending different people together, like experimental musicians and popular musicians. And fundamentally, because to us, they were all releasing interesting music on a format that we were working with. And I think with the exhibitions, the same is true. We've put on lots of exhibitions with people that most museums don't regard as artists. They regard them as filmmakers or video makers or designers or fashion designers or whatever, photographers. I think the thing is, context is so important. When you put them in an exhibition, suddenly they are artists because they're in an art show. And when you put them on a record, suddenly they're part of a record label. I think for my personal background, a lot of that comes from working in publishing and working in magazines, where if you're producing a magazine or any kind of editorial body of work, you're always thinking about how interesting the whole thing is and how these elements fit together or don't fit together. And then you're trying to possibly introduce a few new radical or interesting ideas within the mix and see how your audience responds.
So how long have you been involved in 180 as a place? Because somehow, I mentioned it before, Reverb brings together all these different things that you were involved with for so many years, the Vinyl Factory, Fact Magazine, and 180. So how did it all come together?
I've been at 180 since the beginning, really. I mean, this building was built in 1970. It's a very large brutalist site built on the same site of the Duke of Arundel's old house. So you had, along the river, British history, hundreds of years ago, you had all these dukes that had these enormous mansions along by the river. So that Duke of Somerset had Somerset House, which is why that's called that. And then this was Arundel's site. There's a kind of a little history to it. There's a temple, is the home of the Knights of the Templar, and there's all sorts of interesting history around this area. But the building itself was relatively nondescript. It was an office building. It was home to a very large accountancy company called Arthur Anderson Accounting. There were something like 12,000 employees. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it was a lot of employees. And some of the spaces we now use for our exhibitions were car parks. And that was a car park for their kind of top brass, for their execs. One of Arthur Anderson's main clients at the time, not long before we acquired the space, was Enron. So when Enron went under, so did the accounting company. And actually, funny enough, one of the spaces we sometimes use for exhibitions is this incredible safe. So within one of the basements of the building, there's a safe, and the lock on this door and the thickness of the door is incredible. And the door must be 2 foot thick, 3 foot thick. So God knows what documents they had down there that were sort of secretly stashed away. But I think repurposing space is part of the fun of using industrial buildings to put on exhibitions, and I think the audience responds to that. So yeah, we started putting on exhibitions here in 2016. It was the first exhibition we put on, which was a collaboration with the Hayward Gallery. The Hayward was shut at the time. The Hayward's just over the road, just over the river, rather, on the south bank. We're on the north bank here. We'd been staging exhibitions in some of the other industrial spaces in central London, old car parks, and we had access to this building. We did a collaborative show with the Hayward, which was called The Infinite Mix, which is quite a very well liked and kind of iconic show, which was really a showcase for video art. But again, brought together lots of different artists, some of whom were working in video or pop at the time, especially a director called Khalil Joseph, who was better known for producing pop videos. And that made a huge impact. And then we went from there, and we generally staged these kind of large shows that took over this once nondescript office block and explored all these various spaces.
Would you say that your general approach to creating these exhibitions and curating these exhibitions comes from your experience and your background in publishing, as you mentioned, of conceiving a magazine might be very similar to conceiving an exhibition, of thinking, which topic is it about? How is it relevant? Why does it matter? But also, how do we bring in different artists, different contributors in there to participate and create formats for them to create something meaningful and then deliver it to an audience that can perceive it in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. I'd say that's definitely part of it. I think there's a few factors. There's that. there's also, I suppose, everyone has their own experiences of when they were growing up, different cultural moments that made an impact on them. And I think for me, growing up, I think I certainly I didn't experience any of it personally, but I certainly remember that sort of period in New York where you had this kind of downtown scene, which was very much about all these different sort of musical and artistic forms coming together, centered around like nightclubs and street art and Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. And it just seemed like an incredibly exciting time to be creative in a city. On the flip side of that, we come back to something like the Vinyl Factory, which was always super collaborative, because we weren't a traditional label. We never wanted to own people's rights or sign them up for a long period of time. We were always about project to project. So in a sense, it was very much like creating exhibitions. It was like you do one, then you do another, and you do another. The exhibitions themselves sprang from those different ideas. So in a sense, when we first did an exhibition, it was just really small. It was almost like a pop-up. It was like, we're doing a record. I think the first thing we did was with the XX. First exhibition, we did a record with the XX. And before they'd won the Mercury Music Prize. And they had this very like small video installation. And we were like, oh, we'll put it on the car park. And we did this installation in the car park for a week. And we released the record. And that was the first thing we did. And it just came and went. And everyone had a great time and it was enjoyable. And then we started doing a few more things like that with some of the musicians and artists where it made sense to do it. So we did a show with Grace Jones and a light artist. And we just got more ambitious over time. But ostensibly, it was that fusion of things that made it feel exciting to us. It wasn't just art. It wasn't just music. It was just coming together and expressed itself in different ways. And I guess as time's passed, you know, there are some things, it's interesting you come back to that point, there are some things that have maybe remained more analog, more physical in their sense, like the listening room is super analog. And then there are some things that we do that are much more digital. They involve immersive digital artists, like high-end technology, how like the artists are playing with that technology. But in a sense, they're still very much creating a physical experience. It is something that can be filmed and videoed and broadcast, but it's not the same as being there. And I think that's what appeals to people that want to actually come to the exhibition, the fact that it can't be replicated otherwise.
Also done quite a few specific commissions just for Reverb. From the top of my head, there's Caterina Barberi, Theaster Gates, a bunch of other amazing artists. How did these come about?
We have some really good relationships with those artists. Generally, all the artists in the show we've worked with before on various different things. Often, some of those collaborations just started with a vinyl record. I've gone out or another person's gone out from Vinyl Factory and contacted the artist because they are not just an artist, but they're also a singer or a performer, or they've got a collective that make music. So that always feels like a good starting point. And then when we were producing this exhibition, we spoke to some of those artists. We spoke to Theaster personally and said, we're creating this show. We'd love you to participate in it. I'd love this idea of us having a stage where we can perform. And he was like, yeah, I'm in. Great. And that's it. I could tell him the size of the space and then he produces the work. I mean, he's great.
Sounds like, so easy.
Well, it's not. I mean, it is and it isn't. It can be. One of the joys of this show, I would say, is that I know a lot of the artists personally. We know a lot of the artists personally, and we have really good relationships with them because we just worked together for so long that it's been really nice to be able to reopen some of those relationships that maybe haven't spoken or haven't worked with some of those artists for some time. And there's a new artist, so relatively, there's Julian Knox as an artist in residence here, filmmaker, poet, and he produced a new work for the show. So it generally starts with a conversation. But all of the artists that are in this show wanted to be in the show. So I didn't have to twist their arm particularly to be in the show. They wanted to participate, and we had a kind of sense of the spaces they would have. And because of the relationships, we were able to collaboratively push some of those ideas. Like Jeremy Della's room, for example, I know for a long time, but he's very easygoing and he was very open to ideas. So instead of just showing the film, we said, can we have a mural on the wall? Could we produce a mural for the wall? Yeah. Could we then show this work? So I think he went along with that because he's excited about it. And when I told him that the show his work was incredibly popular and lots of young people were sitting through the entire film, which is 60 minutes, he was amazed. He loved that idea. So hopefully, yeah, most of the artists in the show are excited by participating in something like this because they do a lot of museum projects, which are great. But I think they also want the kind of enthusiasm and urgency that you get by connecting with a younger audience.
What about the Devon Turnbull room? You told me a little bit about it before, and I'm particularly excited about the idea that there's this listening room and listening sessions. You mentioned Random Access Memories by Daft Punk, which is one of my favorite records. So people just come, get a ticket, 30 people sit in a room, they listen to the entire record on vinyl in this sound system, and then they leave, or then there's a discussion about it. So how did the idea for that come about?
Well, I mean, Devon is amazing. So Devon's story is really super interesting because a lot of these people, this is their passion. You know, they've really studied or they've spent time thinking about what they've been doing way before they became known for it. Devon, he had a kind of a fashion label, streetwear label that became quite successful. He sold it. And then to all intents and purposes, he went off grid, but he was exploring his interest in listening spaces, and he spent a lot of time in Japan just going there, meeting people, talking to people, thinking about it without doing anything for years and years and years, and then started putting this thing together. So the fact that it's arrived and it's become a bit of a sensation in a short space of time, there's 10 years work that's been about. That's why it's so impactful, because it's so good. And it's not about it being high end. And the one thing is, it's an amazing sound when you're in there just listening to music. It really feels like a live experience. So it lends itself quite well to records that are either recorded live, produced live, or have live elements to them. So when we come back to Daft Punk, a great artist, but produce music that's been very electronic and also music that has been quite filmic in some ways. But I think Random Access Memories is an album that was obviously recorded with a lot of musicians in studio, and they were so particular about that. They gave some amazing quotes about that. I remember one in particular where they were talking about the Giorgio Moroder collaboration, and they were saying, yeah, we put something like 40 mics in the room and mic'd them up. And they're like, why did you need 40 mics? Who's going to know? And then all they said was like, they will know. And that was it. And it was like, I think that's the thing with all the artists. They all have their own standard. That's what they will do it to. They're not thinking necessarily about other people in maybe the first regard. Just think, do I think it's good enough? And I think that's what makes these works amazing. A lot of these works, like there's a Stan Douglas work, and Stan has been he's probably spent 40 plus years of his life filming and thinking about film and how you approach film. And he's such a student of film, and he's a complete jazz obsessive. So he put these two things together, his obsession with jazz and his particular passion for Miles Davis and film, and made this incredible fly on the wall, fictional live film about a live recording of a jazz album. That's why it's so good, because he's invested most of his life into it. So if you walk in there and know nothing about jazz, you're like, oh, this kind of feels amazing. And if you walk in there and you know everything about Miles Davis, you're still like, this is incredible. So yeah, it's maybe just about selecting those artists that have that approach in some ways.
For me, the key word that you mentioned before is context. Because everything you just said to me is context. And I feel like we nowadays live in a world where context often is lost or doesn't even matter. When you're in a Spotify playlist and the algorithm randomly selects this song or that song, you just follow along, but you have zero context. You often don't even know who the artist is because it just automatically keeps on playing, versus this experience where you present an album in context, and with this 40 mic story and Giorgio Moroder and Daft Punk, you might have listened to that album 100 times before on Spotify in your AirPods. Suddenly you're in that room and you hear something for the first time, right?
I think that's true. I think that it's context, and maybe it's also providing an environment for people that maybe care enough or are more passionate to get together. And it's as simple as that in many ways. And I think it is true that with certain sound systems or certain environments where you're hearing music, whether it's a recording studio or a listening room, you can actually hear things that you haven't heard before. They obviously exist, but I remember releasing a record with an artist years ago, and then he'd made it at home on his kind of fairly basic equipment. And then we went into the studio and did the mastering, and he was like, I didn't even know that existed. So he didn't even hear something he'd made, he didn't know. So I think there's a joy in that. And there's a sort of sense of surprise that you can still discover something that you thought was really familiar. I think people really enjoy that. And then also I think people just enjoy coming together. You know, you have to ask the question why someone who has owned and listened to a record for years and years and years would then leave their home, pay for a ticket, travel across a big city and sit in a room with 20 other people to listen to it again. But I think those are the reasons why, because it matters, because you care about it. You still want to get more joy, more satisfaction from hearing it again. And there are probably some surprises in that. But yeah, the nights themselves, I mean, the evenings rather, they are as simple as that. People come, there's a bar, they can have a drink, but they can't take a drink into the listening room. And they just go in the listening room and they listen to the record. And then they're welcome to stay and have a chat and then have a drink and leave. But likewise, they don't have to. The curated evenings with the DJs, they're a bit longer, and they're not ordained, so you don't know exactly what you're going to hear. You probably have a sense of like you're going to listen to records from a certain period or a certain era, but you don't know what those records are necessarily going to be. So there's more of a surprise, I suppose, in that.
To end the conversation, I'm curious what you're currently working on, what goes through your head. What's the next exhibition? What's the next collaboration? What's the next project you're currently working on?
In terms of 180, we've got 3 or 4 shows that we're working on for the next year. A couple of really big shows, one of which I'm currently working on, which will take place after Reverb in the exhibition spaces that Reverb occupies, and a couple of smaller exhibitions. We're going to also keep the listening room going. So the listening room will be definitely here for the next year, which is fantastic because there's so much more to do. There's just so many more records to play, to celebrate, bring people together, to have different evenings and events around that. And people just respond so warmly to it that we're really excited about that. But yeah, the next exhibition, I can't really tell you who it is, but I can say that there's an artist we worked with before who's a really young artist. We met him when he was 19. And when he came to us when he was 19, he'd really only been photographing for maybe a year, taking photos for a year, and he'd done a few sort of projects, but nothing that anyone would know about. And he came to us with this idea for a film and said, I want to go make this film. It's about this. Would you commission it? And we just really got on with him and just thought, there's just something about you that we just like. We like what you've done, even though it's very limited. And you're not asking for a lot in a way. You're just asking for someone to give you an opportunity. So we're like, yeah, fine, we'll commission it. And then so sometimes we'll commission things like that and we don't necessarily know what we're going to do with it. We know we'll show it at some point, but we don't have a plan. And then, now 5 years later, we're going to put on a huge show of his work. He's done really well for himself, not through us, to be honest.
So it took 5 years to make the film, or it took 5 years now to put
we've already shown. Okay. We already showed that film. So we showed that film. We did a very small exhibition with him a few years ago, and now we're going to do a really big show. And he's got a huge audience now, and he's doing some amazing collaborations with all sorts of people in different fields. He's a photographer, filmmaker. He works with musicians. He works with other artists. He works with design. He's just representative in many ways of just a young person working in great creative art, great field. He doesn't really see a difference between one or the other, although he would regard himself probably first and foremost as an artist. So yeah, that's really pleasing.
And is the thing that excites you when working with all these amazing artists to provide the right context for them to go back again to context?
Not necessarily, because I feel like that is probably a more traditional approach, like for a curator to provide context. This show has its own context because it's ostensibly everything's tied together through the Vinyl Factory, so that is the context. But yes, it's also about music and art. It's more general, it's more fluid. And I think for this artist, there'll be information, but we won't direct that. I think we'll provide the setting. So these are the environments. We'll work on the rooms, the spaces, the artworks, but essentially, by and large, in the same way that we've done with the record label, we sort of choose the artist, support them, work with them, but don't tell them what to do. And I think that's so far, touch wood, that's has been successful for us. And I think that'll be the same sort of going forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
You're welcome. Nice to speak to you.
That was Sean Bitter. You can visit Reverb and Devon Turnbull's listening room at 180 Strand in central London and check out more of Sean's work at thevinylfactory.com and factmag.com. This is the Culture and Technology Podcast, produced by the Vienna Business Agency. The Vienna Business Agency supports new companies, projects, and products that develop Vienna's creative industries further.